Excellent. Well, welcome back. Thank you for attending the first session. If you're just joining us, you're actually part of the Mach 30 Apogee II. I mentioned that in the intro. This is our strategic planning session. Second presentation for the public outreach is mine. I'll be presenting on the spaceflight portion of the Venn diagram for those that remember the three circles: the open source, spaceflight, and makers. So we're on to spaceflight. And the terminology we use is called making a spacefaring civilization. There's a couple of aspects of that probably get into later in the presentation. But just to introduce myself, again, my name is Greg Moran. My day job is with the Air Force, research and development acquisition person. My interests, of course, match space. So I do a lot of space flight in the Air Force, or try to, and space flight in my free time. So moving on, next slide. So I think during Jeremy's presentation, he mentioned it. Next slide. Space is cool. We're all here because we like space. And by show of hands in the audience, who's geeked out about space? There we go. Everybody's hand. Oh, you're here today, right? I would consider that, right? Even a little bit. Yeah, so you're here today. And I've been inspired by outer space for as long as I can remember. It goes back to, as a kid, looking up at the night sky. Next slide. Fascinated, like I mentioned in the introduction, by the vastness of an infinite universe. And that provides so much potential out there that I can't help but want to explore. And space provides that avenue for me. What's even more fascinating is the idea to travel to and from space, not just to go out there and send, next slide, not just to go and send robotic probes to do sensor missions, but to send people to travel out there and to actually experience it firsthand. That's such a powerful experience, and some astronauts talk about being changed or somehow given a different perspective, looking down on an Earth where they've spent their entire life, but from a completely different perspective. They appreciate it so differently. My childhood centered around NASA television. That was back before they had a polished PA appearance. That was back when it was the raw feed from the space station or space shuttle. And I followed every experiment, every mission, the launch, the landing, and even the catastrophes. So it's had a huge impact. The astronauts were my celebrities growing up. Next slide. Now, one of the most impactful experiments to me was a water droplet experiment. For those that are familiar with water here on Earth, it kind of collects in the bottom of a bowl or in a stream. But I saw the water do the weirdest things in space. It formed spheres and globs, and when they pulsed it with sound waves, it had a different behavior than anything I'd ever experienced before. So that memory has been heavily implanted in my brain, and part of the reason I'm so interested, so curious about it. Next slide. The other experiments, of course, some people may know, they did other objects interacting in space. NASA did a whole series of toys in space. That's once they started getting more shiny and polished, and their missions were very scripted. You see a lot of playing, and to me, that's really the ultimate experience: to go to space just for the experience of playing, seeing what it's like. And in fact, every object in space is even more interesting. Even the simplest things like a yo-yo or a soccer ball. Next slide. I also followed the construction of the International Space Station. It's a really bad picture, but that happened basically throughout my adolescent and formative years. They launched the very first module, next slide, Zarya, and docked it with an American module, the Unity Node 1. You can see the partnership between Russian and American technology. Again, if two countries can work together on such a huge project, that in and of itself is another inspirational aspect of space. And so end to end of the ISS mission, the very, very beginning, the docking of 2 modules all the way up to I followed the most recent Progress resupply, which is fortunately able to dock just in the last week or so. Next slide. Progress resupply 40 got up there about 10 days ago, July 5th. So it brought up much needed supplies. It's another bad picture. But the camera view is of the docking of the Progress automated vehicle to the docking port on the space station. Next slide. So you can see that I've been doing space for a long time. Even my AFIT master's degree through the Air Force was space related. And you can see that in the picture here, a bunch of people out on an evening after school with a telescope looking up. I did a lot of that through my research. I did some satellite tracking using ground-based telescopes and taking pictures of objects as they flew overhead. Again, inspirational to see these items that were man-made, that people worked on and built here on the ground, now up in space, traveling thousands and thousands of miles an hour and tracking as I look on the ground. Even more inspirational is the space station, full of humans. That we built these modules, assembled them in orbit, and now people are living there. I don't know if everybody realizes, but there have been humans in orbit continuously since the launch of Expedition 1. And we're at, I should have looked this up, Expedition 30 something now. So that's 15 years, at least. Next slide. But where do we go from here? We're already traveling to and from space. We already have a human presence. I'd say we're not there yet. When to become a spacefaring civilization, I'd say more than 1/100% of humanity has to be able to have access to space. And if you count it up so far, the number of astronauts, the number of space travelers, the number of people who have access to space is a tiny percentage of a fraction of all people. So I want to increase that. I want to shoot for things like interstellar, where everybody can go to and from. Of course, you can recognize some of the other Deep Space Nine, a good example of a spacefaring society, and then the movie 2001, kind of the very beginning of a spacefaring society, reaching out beyond low Earth orbit, sending humans out into the solar system. That's really where we're going, and I see that's inevitable. Humanity has the desire to explore. Space is so inspiring that we have to get out there, and I propose that we're going to. I'd like to see it happen within my lifetime. That's my goal. And you heard Jeremy mention Mach 30's mission to advance humanity to hasten the advancement of humanity into a spacefaring civilization. So that's what we're trying to do. And how we're going to do that, I'll talk about through the rest of the presentation. Ultimately, next slide. Elon Musk says it best. We're going to become a multi-planetary species. That's kind of the goal. And I see it's going to take a lot of different efforts, a lot of different people, and a lot of different contributions to get there. It's a difficult project. Next slide. It's going to take a lot of science. It's going to take a lot of engineering. And as Jeremy said, it's going to take a lot of makers, a lot of people doing their skills and talents to get us there. Some of the engineers or rocket scientists in the room might recognize a rocket flow, a nozzle, a divergent, convergent, expanding bell nozzle. Next slide. You got to do designs of a console or the human interface. This is the landing module of the lunar module. Pretty complicated and technical. Next slide. What got us out to the moon was the Saturn V rocket. Again, a very complicated technical piece of equipment. And there were so many moving parts that all had to work correctly. It was amazing that we were able to do that. Next slide. It's even more complex than that, because once the hardware is done, you have to plan the mission. There's so many things that could go wrong between here and the moon, or the Lagrange points, or Mars, or an asteroid, or wherever we're going. And it takes a lot of rigor to do that. Next slide. So we got mission operations, you got the hardware, you got launch, you have control algorithms, and you have to test it all to make sure it works. That takes systems engineering, that takes a lot of skill. When we talk about doing rocket science and when we talk about opening it up and getting makers involved and publishing this stuff on the internet, we always get the question, well, what about ITAR? Some people might know about that. Next slide. ITAR, yes, it's out there. And yes, it's one of those regulations that gives us a hard time. So we're going to have to work through it. We've decided that we're going to play by the rules. We have to follow the law. Next slide. And it is not just ITAR. There's other regimes out there that control what type of technology can be released. Unfortunately, rockets look a lot like missiles. And missiles are weapons. We can't export weapons technology to our potential adversaries. And that's something that I take very seriously with my day job. I have to deal a lot with the international trafficking in arms regulations. There's also the Department of Commerce that says there's another list of things that you can't export from a commerce perspective. And there's also the Missile Technology Control Regime. That's an agreement or partnership among nations that say you can't share weapon technology, weapons secrets with our potential adversaries. So yes, we understand that, and we're going to have to play by the rules. That makes it more challenging. That definitely means we can't just play with our fun toys and show everybody all about it. We have to play within the rules, and we are committed to doing that. Next slide. So we're working with the Department of State. We're working within the bounds of ITAR. We're working with the Federal Aviation Administration, the FAA Office of Commercial Space Transportation. They're the ones that control access to things like launch facilities and control operations of launch facilities, certifications, and oversight of those kind of operations. We know it's going to be hard. We know that it's a lot of bureaucracy and administration. Basically, that's my day job, so I'm used to it. And we're committed to working within that. Next slide. The alternative is not acceptable. We know some folks, we've seen examples of folks that are not playing by the rules. We don't want to be one of them. We don't want to open ourselves up to that risk. And ultimately, the volunteers that work on our projects. As Jeremy mentioned, it's the community that's involved here, and we want to protect them just as much as we want to protect ourselves. So, next slide. In order to do that, we're starting small, on the order of kites, like you heard Jeremy talk about. The first kite we're doing in a policy standpoint or for the export control projects is called the ITAR Easy, modeled after the IRS's forms 1040 Easy. Because most people are familiar with doing their taxes every year. Most people know how hard it is to figure out the codes of the IRS. What applies to you, what doesn't apply, what kind of exemptions can you get? Well, there's a IRS form that simplifies it. We did the same thing with ITAR, and we're going to continue to do this with each of the various categories within ITAR. Spacecraft is one. We want to put together these products and be able to communicate to our members what is appropriate to share and what's not. Next slide. And then from the technical side, from our technical approaches, you know spaceflight is difficult. You've seen a lot of organizations attempt a lot of space projects, some successful and some not. We want to make sure that our projects are as successful as we can. So next slide. We're starting small. We're doing kites and scaling up from there. A level 1 kite might be the Shepard test stand. A level 2 kite might be an order of magnitude more expensive. And ultimately, we want to get to the scale of launch. On the right-hand side there, you'll see Copenhagen Suborbital's crafts. That's ideally the scale of what Mach 30 is getting towards. And the stepping stone approach is what we think is going to sustain us to get there. Next slide. Again, our technical roadmap is a stepping stone approach, but we're also looking at the entire architecture. In a systems engineering sense, you have a bunch of different components that have to work well together in order to have a successful space mission. You might not be able to see it in the back, but GPS is a great example. The whole architecture has to work for your GPS to work. Next slide. Mach 30 is going to augment or tackle every portion of the architecture and publish as openly as we can. The first thing obvious to mention is the ground sphere, which is a ground receiver. That's one critical component. Well, we're going to work on all the components in time. Next slide. So some of the other components we've already talked about. The ground sphere is one. Propulsion technology for launch vehicles is another. Then Jeremy talked about how makers were involved in this new thrust, cold gas thruster, and stepping stones in a more advanced technology. We are going to continue down this path with more advancements and more technology, given all the support from our community. That's people like you. So we want to see as many people involved in this as possible with a variety of skills, a variety of interests. And to do that, we want you to engage with us wherever you're at online. Next slide. If you're on Facebook or any of the social media sites, please check us out there. If you have a project or if you want to share a project, we recommend the Open Design Engine for hardware projects. And if you're interested in just hearing more about us, sign up for our email newsletters. But ideally, it's all about your contributions and your help, because we can't do it without you. And that's what our motto means, ad astra per civitas, to the stars through community. Thank you very much.